The first statistic that we're looking at is life expectancy. And the first graph that we see here is the overall distribution of deaths per age group for all Australians. And we see two main significant assumptions here in the data, mainly that most people die at an older age, and we also see, we can also observe that there's a small spike in the 0 to 4 years of age group for death rates. When we look at the life expectancy for non-Indigenous Australians, we see that the first observation from the previous graph is actually amplified, i.e. that more people die at an older age. We also see that the second observation from the previous graph, where we saw a significant spike in the age group 0 to 4 years of age, is actually significantly reduced. When we change that to look at the life expectancy for Indigenous Australians, the death rate is actually much higher during what we would consider the midlife by comparison to non-Indigenous Australians. And we also see that there's a significantly higher death rate in the years 0 to 4 years of age. When we combine the two groups on the same graph, we can see a significant difference between the data shape for Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. And where there's a fairly normal distribution with a mean around about 50 years of age, for Indigenous Australians, we see that for non-Indigenous Australians the death rate trends linearly from birth to 85 years. So when we drill down into the age group of 0 to 4 years, where we saw the spike for Indigenous Australians, we can see that there's a very vast disproportionate death rate amongst the two groups, with the Indigenous Australians for both males and females showing about 5 times higher death rate in this age group. So the next thing that we look at is health statistics, and the first graph that we show is a data visualization of the proportion of Indigenous Australians with diabetes or high blood sugar, and then we actually go on to show a similar graph for a number of different health conditions, so whether it be heart and circulatory problems, eyesight or kidney problems. And then finally we actually want to go and show a correlation between these, or to observe a correlation between these statistics and high alcohol consumption. And so we can see that, for instance, the states that have a high level of kidney disease are also the states that have a high amount of alcohol consumption. So next we look at employment statistics. We see that the unemployment rate over 2005 to 2011, comparing Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, we see a fairly consistent and large disparity between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. And we can see that rate is about 3.5 times higher for Indigenous Australians. So the next statistic that we look at is incarceration rates, and firstly we look at the incarceration rates comparing Indigenous to non-Indigenous Australians over time, so from 2009 to 2013. And we see over this period of time that the incarceration rates for Indigenous Australians is around about 17 times higher than that of non-Indigenous Australians. And so when we look at this on a state-by-state basis, we can see that the major contributor of this is Western Australia, where the comparative incarceration rate for Indigenous Australians is 25 times higher than that of non-Indigenous Australians. And we can see this on a geographical level, that it's actually quite stark, the difference between the western states and the eastern states. So the next area that we look at is education. And firstly we look at the proportion of Australians, Indigenous Australians, that have a highest level of education of less than Year 10 on a state-by-state basis. And we can see that the Northern Territory has over 1/3 of its population where its highest level of education was less than Year 10. And when we compare this to the amount of total government spending on school education per person, we see that the states with lower high school or lower year 10 completion rates are also the ones spending the most money on education. When we look at the statistics about Year 12 completion, we can see some interesting things as well, such as the relationship between the employment rate and Year 12 completion. So now we dive a little bit deeper into the issue of expenditure. And firstly we see the total expenditure per person rates from 2009 to 2013. We see that the amount of spending on Indigenous Australians is much higher and has increased over that time. And we see that when we look at it comparatively, we can see that the amount spent on Indigenous Australians per person compared to non-Indigenous is quite great. And so we can look at this on a geographical basis over time. We can see here the blue circles representing the amount of money per person on non-Indigenous Australians, and green is Indigenous. And we can see that that over time that comparatively stays the same. However, that Indigenous spending tends to increase in a few states. Now, when we look at it as a tag cloud for the whole population, we see that government services and defence is the main area of spending when we look at expenditure per person. And when we look at it on the basis of Indigenous status, for non-Indigenous Australians, we see that the main thing that we spend money on is government services and defence. However, when we compare that to Indigenous Australians, we can see that there's a bit more of a spread where community support and welfare, public health and order and safety, school education, hospitals and services are the areas of expenditure that tend to dominate.